Okay, continuing on with the Unit 8 topic, 8.2, Human Threats to Aquatic Ecosystems. This kind of is going to incorporate some other parts of Unit 8 as well. So here we're looking at wastewater. What we consider wastewater is produced by human activities. Wastewater coming down our sinks, our showers, our toilets, or wastes that are being produced by cattle operations or pigs or chickens. Sometimes you might see reference to different colors of water. Clear, or sometimes it's called blue water. That's clean water that's coming out of our taps. Gray water is soapy, essentially. Soapy water. You can see in my little diagram here, water that's coming from your bathroom sink or your washing machine or your shower. And then black water is the water that has fecal matter in it, and it's coming from your toilet. Or black water might also be very high in nutrients and have, coming from dishwashers where there's food gunk and stuff like that. So that's a definition of wastewater. So wastewater is considered, a water pollutant. And so as we're talking about this wastewater, let me back it up for a second. As we're talking about this wastewater, we're going to be focusing on the nutrient component of wastewater. Looking at things like nitrates and phosphates. And so wastewater that has a lot of fecal matter in it has a lot of nitrates and phosphates because, there's nitrogen and phosphorus in poop. And so this becomes a pollutant. These nitrates and phosphates become a pollutant because this water that has a lot of nitrogen and phosphorus in it has what we call high BOD, biological oxygen demand. What this is referring to, BOD is referring to bacteria that are naturally present everywhere. And when bacteria encounter wastewater that has a lot of nutrients in it, the bacteria begin decomposing the nutrients and breaking the nutrients down. And the process of decomposition requires a lot of oxygen. So any water that is high in nutrients will have a high biological oxygen demand because the bacteria are going to want to decompose those nutrients and break them down. And that process of breaking down the nutrients, or the nitrates and the phosphates, that is going to require a lot of oxygen. And so that is what BOD is referring to. And the second bullet here is everything that I just mentioned to you. Oxygen is required for bacteria to decompose, I keep saying nitrogen and phosphorus, the organic material, the poo that is coming out of your toilet or something along those lines. And so this wastewater can be considered a water pollutant, or water that contains a lot of fecal material is a water pollutant. The higher your oxygen demand, or higher your biological oxygen demand, that tells us that the waters are more polluted, or the waters contain more organic material. Or you could say, these are all synonyms here, or you could say the waters contain high amounts of nitrates and phosphates. How do we know that? Because if bacteria are requiring a lot of oxygen, that means there's a lot of material for them to decompose. So all of this relates to things that we've mentioned previously in the year, talking about dead zones in a body of water. So high biological oxygen demand means you're going to have less oxygen in the water. So less DO, dissolved oxygen. So if there's low oxygen in the water, that means other things that live in the water are going to struggle because, animals need a decent amount of oxygen. So areas in the world where you have a lot of, let's say, nutrient pollution are also going to have a lot of bacterial action. And as that bacteria is decomposing and breaking down poo, otherwise known as waste, that's going to use up a lot of oxygen, which means there's less oxygen in that water, which means that water becomes what we call a dead zone. We've talked about this multiple times throughout the year. A dead zone is like the general layman's term for an area of water that has very low oxygen or even no oxygen. A dead zone forms in the Gulf of Mexico here every spring and summer off the coast of Louisiana, because you've got fertilizers washing into all the rivers up here in the center of the country, because there's a lot of farmland, so farmers are planting crops using fertilizers. The fertilizers, which contain a lot of nitrates and phosphates, wash into all the rivers. The rivers all connect together in one giant watershed, and then they empty into the Gulf of Mexico here. So all of those fertilizers, which contain a lot of nutrients, end up in the Gulf of Mexico. The bacteria that are present there in the Gulf of Mexico are going to then decompose those nutrients and break them down, which means they're using up a lot of oxygen. And so every single year, every season, when farmers are using a lot of fertilizer, we end up seeing a dead zone in the Gulf of Mexico. And it's not just from fertilizer. It could be from farms still in the same area where you've got a lot of livestock and a lot of waste coming from cows and pigs and chickens. And the same ideas hold whether we're talking fertilizers or livestock poop. It's all the same. This graphic here, how a dead zone forms, I've used this earlier in the year, so I'm not going to go through it with you. This is part of 8.5 and eutrophication, which we've talked about over and over again. So something for you to think about here is the creation of a dead zone, an example of a positive or negative feedback loop. I want you to think about it, and we'll come back to that and maybe answer it in class. So kind of in the same vein of what we're talking about here, oxygen usage or biological oxygen demand, you should be familiar with this graphic. Like this one is kind of like a three-dimensional thing, but it can be given to you as just a regular graph on an X and a Y axis. What you're looking at is two different things. You've got two different trend lines. Your blue trend line is your dissolved oxygen concentration. And your red trend line is your BOD, or biological oxygen demand. You can see up here, there is a source of pollution. We're assuming this is like poo coming out of this pipe here. And so what happens? Well, where the poo first enters the water, that poo is going to be very high in organic matter. So the bacteria that are present in the water are going to start decomposing it. And so that means right here where the poo enters the water, the BOD is going to increase rapidly because that is our source of waste material. So the bacteria are going crazy right there, breaking down the poo and using up a lot of oxygen. And as BOD goes up, obviously, dissolved oxygen goes down. It's an inverse relationship. As we get a little bit further away from that source of pollution, going down the river a little ways, the BOD is going to begin decreasing, and slowly the dissolved oxygen will begin increasing. And you can see what's going on here. You've got different organisms that are present. The organisms that you have in these different sections are based on the amount of oxygen. So you can have fishes like carp, which can deal with dirty water. They don't have like huge high oxygen requirements. Excuse me. Here in the septic zone, where dissolved oxygen is at its lowest, you don't have any fish because there has to be some oxygen in the water for fish to survive. And then again, as you get further and further away from the source of pollution, oxygen levels begin to go back up to normal. So what you're looking at here is, again, biological oxygen demand and dissolved oxygen, and they have an inverse relationship. And this is all about a source of pollution, like wastewater. poo, fecal material. And bacteria are decomposing that fecal material and using up oxygen. And that's what you're seeing in this diagram. And I think we're going to call it a day. So this little video here, still part of 8.2. What we're focusing on is looking at things like oxygen levels in the water based on nutrient concentrations. If you have any questions, you know how to reach me. So goodbye for now.